when something is deliberately leaked, in the case of Trump, where it's, there's not even a bit of plausible deniability, it's just open. That, of course, changes things because these text messages are supposed to be confidential, right? Confidentiality is the number one resource in diplomacy. And this, of course, burns bridges.
Ahead of his trip to Davos, Donald Trump has published several private texts from world leaders. They border on the sycophantic, with Emmanuel Macron asking him out to dinner, and the NATO leader Mark Rutte sending, for example, "Can't wait to see you." But will Trump posting these messages spell the end of this kind of text diplomacy? Well, Marieke Kleine is a political scientist at the London School of Economics and an expert on this kind of informal or confidential communication, and joins me now. Marieke, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us. How widespread is the use of messaging apps like WhatsApp or Signal in high-level diplomacy today? Because, it all used to be sort of, cables and official briefings and so on. Now are they texting each other all the time?
Right, yeah. So we really have to distinguish between high level and sort of more junior level. And in fact, especially since COVID, at the junior level, much of the negotiations now take place via, for instance, WhatsApp messages, WhatsApp groups, and so on. At the senior level, not so much. Text messages have been around, of course, but they were usually much more of a complement to the official diplomacy, to cables and so on. In a way, you can think about text messages between senior politicians as more like the grease to the wheels, that they clarify, communicate, they reassure, they signal, they say, look, this is coming your way. You should interpret it in this way. So it's more like a complement to the official diplomacy rather than really replacing it.
And when this is happening at a top level, when you have the likes of Macron texting Trump, for example, that must just be an absolute nightmare for whole departments of diplomats, because they don't know what's going on. They don't know what's been said. Nobody sees this. Nobody records this.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, ideally, this would be just a complement to what everyone else knows and what is coming through the official channels anyway. But we see more and more that Trump is sort of challenging these norms. Trump likes to do diplomacy via social media. We already know this. Shouldn't be a surprise that he now also takes to text messaging. But it's indeed a concern, especially for archivists, for archives, how much of this will actually remain in the public record.
And look, what are the risks for governments when these kind of messages are shared or leaked? Because, back in the olden days, you needed an organisation like WikiLeaks, or you needed sort of high-level investigative journalism to find out what, for example, the Secretary-General of NATO had been saying to the President. Now the President just puts it online. This must change everything.
Yeah, of course, leaks have always been a problem. It's well known, and leaks typically happen when there's some plausible deniability, right? When you can say, oh, this was my department, or this was this other guy. We've seen also high-level precautions against this. So just some anecdote, for instance, just a couple of years ago, we saw that there've been a case at the United Nations where a closed Security Council consultations was effectively live tweeted from a diplomat to a journalist while the meeting was still ongoing. So, the politicians are learning and they're trying to take precautions. At the European Council, for instance, at really high-level European Council meetings, especially when it comes to high-level appointments, leaders are sometimes required to surrender their mobile phones at the entrance, right? So, somebody telling Macron, sorry, you can't get in unless you hand me your mobile phone. But of course, when something is deliberately leaked, in the case of Trump, where it's, there's not even a bit of plausible deniability, it's just open. That, of course, changes things because these text messages are supposed to be confidential, right? Confidentiality is the number one resource in diplomacy. And this, of course, burns bridges. And I would not be surprised that if in the future Trump will receive much fewer of these messages.
Well, I mean, so look, the messages that Trump got from Macron and Mark Rutte, he released himself, seemingly sort of on a whim in the middle of the night on his phone. The message he sent to the Norwegians, in which he talked about moving beyond peace, was released by the Norwegians as part of a freedom of information request, like through the normal channels. Should we understand some kind of difference there, or is it just leaking a message that wasn't necessarily intended to be public?
Right. Yeah. Well, if Trump had done his research, he should know that, the Norwegians are notoriously transparent and something like this does happen. But he didn't even know that the Norwegian government does not control the Nobel Peace Committee, Prize Committee. So this doesn't necessarily surprise, right? So I don't think you can't really blame the Norwegians for this, but Trump obviously he has the choice to do this, and he does not give what he doesn't give, and I think this just destroys confidentiality, and it destroys trust. But of course, this isn't good this is neither good for Trump, but it's also not good for the European leaders, because they use one really confidential background channel to Trump, which is desperately needed in these times.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you finally, Marieke, is if the sort of the evidence, the history of these messages sort of leaking more and more, particularly when they're sent to Trump, if this stops leaders from messaging each other like this, from keeping these kind of sort of back channels of communication open, these informal channels of communication open, if that doesn't happen anymore, will we be better off or worse off?
I think we will be pretty much in the same place, because there are alternatives to, text diplomacy. I mean, it was possible to have diplomacy before mobile phones were invented. But of course, what is really important for confidential messaging, for confidential communication, which is the key here, which is what makes diplomacy better or worse, you need trust, and that trust is just at the lowest level, ever.
Marieke Kleine of the London School of Economics, thank you very much indeed for your time.